Do werewolf transformations hurt? How do you become a werewolf? Where do werewolves come from? And more importantly, is the condition curable? If you're like me and have a million questions about werewolves, then don't worry, we're gonna answer all those questions you have and show you everything you've ever wanted to know about werewolves. So to get started,
turn to page 394.
First, what is a werewolf? This is a very important definition to get right. The name itself helps us identify what a werewolf is. The history of the name is very deep, but on the surface level, it's an Old English word, werewolf. Essentially means man-wolf, and that is critical for knowing what one is. If you've ever played Skyrim, then at this point, you might realize that if you start as a lizard man, you are not technically a werewolf when you turn into a wolf. I don't know what you are, but you're something else. Anyway, looking at the word lycanthrope also comes from the ancient Greek words lykos, which means wolf, and thropos, which means human being. With that context, to put things in the simplest terms, a werewolf is any person who can turn into a wolf or a wolf-man hybrid, either when they want to or completely unwilling in a real or true transformation. So it's any person who can turn into a wolf. That means that dreams, spells, and illusions don't count. This is a very important distinction, which we'll get to in a minute. Now you're probably wondering, are werewolves actually real? That is a very important question. And for this, we need to go all the way back to the witch hunts back in 1589. In particular, the case of Peter Stump. I need to warn you now, this case is quite disturbing. The case became famous at the time, likely due to the horrid nature of what happened, and the case sets the stage for even present-day views on werewolves. So what happened? While he was being threatened with torture, he confessed that he had the power to turn into a werewolf. Also, he confessed to the killing and eating of 14 children and 2 pregnant women. And it gets worse, and honestly, it's a bit too disturbing to tell, but I can say he apparently described his cannibalism as dainty morsels. Does this mean that werewolves are real since we have a real-life confession? It's very hard to say, especially when someone is faced with torture, and he certainly was. But even if he wasn't a werewolf, he certainly appeared to at least be a cannibal. For those crimes, he had one of the most brutal deaths ever recorded. I won't go into detail, but it involved a wheel, red-hot pincers, and the blunt side of an axe head. Anyway, his clearly demented actions and many other stories have led scientists in the modern era to try and figure out a rational explanation for all the fear about werewolves. Some scientists, like Dr. Lee Illes, have tried to explain werewolves as a medical condition. Dr. Illes thought that maybe, just maybe, people claiming to have witnessed werewolves were actually talking about people with a condition called porphyria. It's a rare thing where people are super sensitive to light, have red teeth, and are in a mental state called psychosis. But not everyone agrees with Dr. Illes. Another gentleman named Woodward says werewolves in stories usually look more like real wolves, not people with porphyria. Then there's this other idea that maybe people with a condition called hypertrichosis were mistaken for werewolves. This condition is when someone has a lot of hair all over their body. But Woodward also refutes this and says that hypertrichosis is too rare to explain the abundance of werewolf stories. So, what did Woodward think? He thought that maybe people saw others acting all weird because of rabies, and thought they were turning into werewolves. But even his idea isn't in the original werewolf stories. So far, we only have evidence of mental delusions, and some people who claim to have been able to turn into a wolf without clear evidence. Does that mean for some, there are no werewolves? Probably. But just like other supernatural phenomenon, there's always that small chance of something supernatural at play. Maybe some god or deity getting involved somewhere deep in history? Well, that brings us to the next question. Who or what started this idea of werewolves to begin with? The legend starts with the Wolfmen. So who were they? We're diving way back in history, before things were even written down. The Kurios are a theoretical group of military men believed to exist during the time of the prehistoric Proto-Indo-Europeans. They're really old. It's before Europe. Anyway, the Kurios were basically young men who were initiated into manhood by this rite of passage. They were sent off for a few years to survive and fight enemies. What did these guys have to do with werewolves? These guys are described as being shape-shifting warriors, metaphorically and symbolically, and would wear wolf skins and adopt wolf-like behaviors. They would break many rules of decent human society during their time in the warband, like stealing and unspeakable things to women. But when they completed their time and returned to society, they had no remorse for their misdeeds because they believed that they had not been humans during that time. So, these guys are the earliest examples of the idea of men adopting the traits of wolves. But what about actually turning into a wolf? These guys were just pretending to be wolves. Where does that start? Who was the first? All these questions bring us to Zeus. Zeus is the culprit for the existence of the first known werewolf. So what happened? King Lycaon happened. King Lycaon was known far and wide for his immense pride and his belief that he was equal to the gods themselves. His arrogance knew no bounds, and he sought to challenge the very authority of Zeus, the mighty king of all gods. Legend has it that King Lycaon devised a devious plan to test Zeus's wisdom and powers. He decided to serve Zeus a meal that included human flesh, horrifically, one of his own children. He believed that if Zeus was truly all-knowing, he he would be able to tell that something was amiss. In his mind, he thought this would prove that he was smarter than the gods. Infuriated by Lycaon's audacity and disgusted by his sacrilege, Zeus unleashed his wrath upon the king. In a swift and merciless act of divine justice, Zeus blasted all of Lycaon's 50 other sons with lightning and transformed Lycaon into a monstrous wolf. From that moment on, King Lycaon was cursed to roam the woods of Arcadia, forever haunted by his own evil. There is a bit of a happy ending here though, and that is that Zeus revived the child and the boy went on to rule Arcadia. Thank goodness for resurrections. Anyway, are werewolves actually dangerous? This really depends on what stories you look at. All of our modern stories generally show a terrible wolfman hybrid who's totally out of his mind, only focused on killing and eating people or animals. And for good reason. Once again, you can thank Peter Stump for that. The craze around his insanity, brutal killings, and eating people solidly added fuel to the fire about the nature of werewolves. But that isn't the only example of werewolf behavior. Zeus is involved yet again. In ancient Greece, there's a story of, I'm not gonna say this right, Demarchus of Parrhasia, who also turned into a wolf after eating a child sacrificed to Zeus. The horror of these people. The author of the story, Pliny the Elder, details that this was not a one-off event, but happened frequently to those who ate human flesh at the altar of Zeus. So naturally, it looks like all werewolves are dangerous, right? Well, no. There are other stories of werewolves being completely fine in history. In Marie de France's poem, the nobleman Bisclavret, French, we're just gonna call him Bis. The nobleman Bis begged the king for mercy by kissing the king's feet and legs when he was in wolf form. The king was amazed by the wolf's behavior and took him back to the castle to live with him. The legends of werewolves in Turkic folklore, the wolf was an ancestor of the Turkic people. So if you saw a werewolf, it should be viewed with great respect, and it wasn't aggressive towards people. We have modern day examples of werewolves that are completely fine, such as in Twilight. They do meet the technical definition of werewolf. So with all this being said, as everyone wants to know, how do you actually become a werewolf? Okay, there are a ton of ways that have been recorded on how to become a werewolf. You've likely already heard about the most common way, which is used in Harry Potter. This modern way of becoming a werewolf is caused by being bitten by a werewolf in their beast form. J.K. Rowling notes that this would not work if you were bit when the werewolf was in human form. This is a much more modern take on becoming a werewolf, however. In the case of Peter Stump, he simply used a belt to become one. Other cases suggest that you use a magic salve on your body. Others have detailed that drinking rainwater out of a wolf print in the ground or from an enchanted stream could turn you into a werewolf. Some old Russian folklore details an incantation to transform yourself. And in other parts of Europe, like Italy, France, and Germany, it was believed that if you slept outside on a summer night with a full moon shining directly on your face, you would become a werewolf. But with the rise of the witch trials panic, it arose that the transformations into werewolves were accomplished by satanic rituals or deals with the devil. This more closely resembles the majority of ancient beliefs that there was some sort of divine punishment, such as when Zeus curses and transforms Lycaon, or anyone who ate human flesh at his altar. This all leads us squarely into the next question: how do werewolves transform, and is it painful? We've already mentioned how Zeus would essentially snap his fingers and you could be a werewolf. Presumably, this was instantaneous transformation and not at all painful, and there was no full moon required. Some werewolves can either transform whenever they want or at specific times. Like in the poem about the nobleman, he had to transform into a wolf every week, and his transformation lasted 3 days. In order for him to transform back, he needed his clothes. In the case of Peter Stump, he claimed that he had a magic belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf at any time, and when he wished to turn back, all he had to do was take the belt off. In an ancient Greek story, a man would cross a marsh and be totally transformed into a wolf when he reached the other side. But nowadays, the moon is the trigger, which more closely reflects the beliefs in Italy, Germany, and France. Although now, it should be noted that the werewolf doesn't need to visually see the moon to transform, and it seems to be able to begin once the sun has set. It also appears to be quite painful, and this makes sense, as all your bones and muscles would need to physically shift around, grow, and break in order to assume the form of the wolf. So if you've been changed into a werewolf, what are the abilities and weaknesses of werewolves? Modern day views of werewolf abilities and weaknesses are: number 1, you have enhanced strength during the full moon. It's like having a secret superpower hidden inside of you, waiting to burst out when the time is right. Number 2, they have super senses like smelling and hearing really well. This often carries over to their human state as well as when they're in wolf form. When a person becomes a werewolf, it's not just their appearance that changes, their senses get a major upgrade too. They can sniff out scents from miles away, and their hearing, it's so sharp they can pick up the faintest rustle of leaves in the wind, or can sense from quite a long distance enemies that are approaching. Number 3, speed. Werewolves get a massive speed upgrade, just like being able to run as fast as a wolf. Number 4, they can heal quickly, so cuts and bruises don't bother them for long. If you get a scratch or a bruise, it's not really a big deal. Often this rapid healing process begins after being bitten from the original werewolf. However, in some stories, like in Harry Potter, the injuries that you get from a werewolf will often leave scars, but any other injuries you get will heal feel completely fine. So what are their weaknesses? Well, number one, they transform into a werewolf whether they want to or not. When there's a full moon, they're gonna transform. Number two, and this is the most common one, silver hurts them a lot. It's like their kryptonite. Silver might be shiny and pretty to look at, but for a werewolf, it's like touching a hot stove. It hurts and it burns their skin and it can create permanent damage. It's their ultimate weakness and one of their biggest vulnerabilities. Now, this does depending upon what story you're reading. In Harry Potter, silver doesn't actually cause permanent damage to a werewolf. It's just a myth in those stories. However, in others, it's definitely the case. Number two, they can't control themselves when they're werewolves. Again, this is a modern view of werewolves. Generally today, werewolves lose their mind and they go total beast mode. However, it does depend on what story you're looking at, and of course in history, there are some examples of men being able to retain their wits when they're in wolf form. Number three, this is kind of a strange weakness, but they essentially need to keep this a secret. If the rest of the world finds out that they're a werewolf, they'll be locked up or killed. Speaking of other humans and their view of werewolves, this leads us straight into the next question: is it a curse or a disease, or is it neither one? In the early days, the condition of lycanthropy was almost always viewed as a divine punishment or a curse. It wasn't until the shift towards rationalism during the Renaissance that the condition started to be more closely viewed as a disease. But there was a branch of views here. On the Western side, views of the werewolf became more associated with witchcraft and the occult. However, on the Eastern side, werewolves started to be more associated with the revenant or vampires. And this view, the one associated with vampires, has more strongly won out how werewolves are viewed and behave today, with the bite being the mode of infection. So in the past, it was more associated with curses, but now it's more closely associated with diseases. So now that you know all this about a werewolf, how do you actually fight or stop one? This is a lot trickier than trying to fight a vampire in a lot of ways. Well, I guess that depends on the vampire. Anyway, the biggest way to fight or stop a werewolf is to know who they are and cage them or chain them before they transform. This is true whether they can transform at will or not. This would contain the threat. Now, obviously, you may not know who they are. Even the Ministry of Magic and Harry Potter couldn't get any of them to register themselves. Who wants that social pressure? Anyway, by now you're probably dealing with a werewolf that transforms with a full moon and is basically out of his mind. Legend holds that werewolves in their transformed state cannot die by most means like gunshots or swords unless you use silver blades or bullets. Silver, as we mentioned before, is a massive weakness to werewolves. It was discovered in Germany in the 18th century. So if you can't lock them up before their transformation, stockpile yourself some silver bullets or weapons and be ready for them. The other thing you can do is lock yourself in a safe room. This is where you should get in and wait until the werewolf changes back into his or herself. Since we just mentioned it, this begs the question, can women be werewolves? Well, most legends contain men transforming into werewolves, but there are a few cases of women. In Armenian lore, there are cases of some women who commit some of the deadly sins and are cursed to spend 7 years in wolf form. This might lead you to question, are there other forms of were? Well, it certainly seems so. In Africa, they had were hyenas. In India, were tigers, as well as other forms of were cats. But none of these were as prevalent or dominant as the werewolf. So this all leads us to the big question, can this condition be cured or removed? Well, in ancient history, the gods would usually provide some sort of condition that you could shake the curse and become human again, except for Lycaon. He was screwed. Usually the condition was that you couldn't consume human flesh while you spent your several years as a wolf. Other cases, you could simply take off the wolf skin or belt and there was nothing to cure. But what we really want to know is, can the usual werewolf today who contracted lycanthropy through a bite be cured of his condition? Well, there are 4 remedies that were practiced in medieval Europe that were said to remove the condition. The first method was through medicine, using the plant wolfsbane. Wolfsbane is actually poisonous to humans, just so you know, but it was said that it could help reverse the disease of lycanthropy. In Harry Potter, while there was no cure for lycanthropy, there was a potion you could take involving wolfsbane that could dull the painful effects of transformation. The 2 other prominent methods that were used in medieval Europe were surgery, I don't really know how that one would work, or exorcism. However, these usually resulted in the person dying. The final cure that was promoted the most and seemed to work, several saints wrote about the conversion to Christianity. This was said to remove the disease or curse and provide protection against further infection. So there you have it. If you've been turned into a werewolf, perhaps you should consider Christianity. Otherwise, you may be doomed to walk around as a werewolf forever. I guess depending upon what kind of werewolf you are, that could be good, but probably it's bad. It's probably bad. Anyway, if you like this video, please share it with someone that you know. Thanks. Later.